On the morning of August 30th, 1954, a formation of American aircraft crossed into Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula in the far northeast of the Soviet Union, flew a path that took them directly over several of the most sensitive military installations on Soviet territory, photographed what they found, and returned to Alaska without asking permission from the government of the country they had just overflown. Without informing the President of the United States that the mission was taking place, and without any legal authority whatsoever under international law or American statute, the mission was ordered by General Curtis Emerson LeMay, Commander of Strategic Air Command, the branch of the United States Air Force responsible for delivering nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union in the event of war. LeMay ordered it because he wanted to know what was on the other side of the border, because the intelligence the CIA and the other services were providing him was insufficient for the targeting requirements of the war plans he was building, and because he had calculated, with the straightforward arithmetic that characterized everything he did, that the worst the Soviets could do in response was shoot the planes down, which they failed to do, and that if they protested diplomatically, the United States could deny the mission had taken place, which it did. The Soviet Union filed a formal diplomatic protest. The United States denied the mission had occurred. LeMay had his photographs. This was how Curtis LeMay operated. He identified what he needed. He assessed the obstacles. He decided the obstacles were acceptable, and he acted. The question of whether he had the authority to act was a question he considered largely irrelevant, because authority in LeMay's framework was something that derived from capability and will, and he had both, and the people who were nominally above him in the chain of command had, in his judgment, neither the capability nor the will to do what needed to be done. LeMay was not a rogue in the sense of a man acting against his own government's interests as he understood them. He was something more unsettling than that. A man who had concluded that his understanding of the national interest was more accurate than the understanding of the elected civilians he was supposed to serve, and who had the institutional position and the personal force to act on that conclusion in ways that brought the world measurably closer to nuclear war on multiple occasions across a career that spanned nearly 3 decades at the top of the American military establishment. To understand what LeMay did and why it mattered, and why it still matters, you have to understand first who he was and where he came from, because the man did not appear from nowhere. He was produced by a specific history, shaped by a specific set of experiences, and the experiences that shaped him most completely were experiences of what happened when you did not hit hard enough and did not hit first. Curtis Emerson LeMay was born in Columbus, Ohio, in November 1906, the eldest of 7 children in a family that moved frequently and had little money. His father was a laborer who found and lost work in a pattern that kept the family in a state of permanent marginal instability, and LeMay grew up with the conviction, formed early and never substantially revised, that security was something you built yourself through will and preparation, and the willingness to do what other people flinched from. He put himself through Ohio State University, working part-time jobs, joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps because it offered a small stipend, and developed an interest in aviation that eventually led him to the Army Air Corps, which he joined as a cadet in 1929. He was not a natural social presence. He was taciturn to the point of seeming hostile, uncomfortable with small talk, impatient with anything he regarded as ornamental, and possessed of a physical intensity, a heaviness of jaw and directness of gaze that people who met him tended to describe in terms that stopped just short of frightening. He chewed cigars rather than smoking them. He rarely smiled in photographs. He had the quality, rare in military officers and rarer in senior ones, of meaning exactly what he said, which made him both more useful and more dangerous than the men around him, who had learned to communicate in the diplomatic indirection of institutional politics. What LeMay could do, what made him genuinely exceptional, was navigate. He became one of the finest navigators in the Army Air Corps in the early 1930s, developing skills in aerial navigation at a time when the instruments were primitive and the techniques were still being invented. And the skills he built then formed the foundation of everything that followed, because what navigation required was the same thing that strategic bombing would later require: precise knowledge of where you were, where the target was, and what it would take to get there without error. He flew long-distance missions in the mid-1930s that established records and built his reputation. Intercepted an Italian ocean liner 700 miles at sea in a demonstration of the Air Corps' ability to locate and reach targets far from shore. And by the late 1930s had developed a reputation as the best instrument-rated pilot in the service and one of its most capable planners. When the war came, he was ready for it in a way that most of his contemporaries were not. LeMay's World War II career is where the man who would later argue for nuclear first strikes was formed, and the formation is essential to understanding the argument. He commanded bomber groups in Europe in 1942 and 1943, developing the tactics and the training regimes that would eventually make the 8th Air Force's precision daylight bombing campaign operationally viable, though at costs in aircraft and men that were, for extended periods, barely sustainable. He introduced the combat box formation, a staggered arrangement of bombers that maximized mutual defensive fire, and he established the rule that formation leaders would not take evasive action on the bomb run, would fly straight and level into flak, because evasive action scattered bombs and scattered bombs did not hit targets, and the point of the mission was to hit targets. The men who flew under this rule hated it, and it got some of them killed, and it worked, because the bombs hit the targets. LeMay understood something about strategic bombing that took some of his contemporaries years to learn, that accuracy was not a nicety, but the operational foundation of the entire enterprise, that a bombing campaign which missed its targets was not merely inefficient, but was actively counterproductive, consuming aircraft and men and fuel and ordnance in exchange for nothing, while leaving the enemy's productive capacity intact. He transferred to the Pacific in 1944 and took command of the B-29 bombing campaign against Japan, inheriting a program that was producing almost nothing. The B-29s were flying high-altitude precision missions from the Marianas against Japanese industrial targets and missing them, because the jet stream at high altitude scattered the bombs, and the cloud cover over Japan made visual targeting impossible for weeks at a time. LeMay looked at the situation and made a decision that was, by any conventional military logic, startling. He stripped the defensive armament from the B-29s to save weight and fuel. He loaded them with incendiary bombs rather than high explosives. He sent them in at night, at low altitude, directly over Japanese cities. The first mission using these tactics against Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and left 1 million people homeless. LeMay described the results as outstanding. He continued the firebombing campaign for the next 5 months, systematically destroying the urban and industrial fabric of Japan at a rate and on a scale that had no precedent in the history of aerial warfare. By the time the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, LeMay's conventional firebombing had already killed more people than either atomic bomb would kill. He had, in 5 months of operations, reduced Japan's capacity to wage industrial warfare to near zero. He had done it with a ruthlessness that he neither apologized for nor attempted to disguise. He said, in later years, that if the United States had lost the war, he supposed he would have been tried as a war criminal. He said it without particular distress. He had done what was necessary to win. The civilian deaths were the price of the target's proximity to civilian areas, and the target was legitimate, and the price was paid. This is the mind that arrived at the command of Strategic Air Command. In October 1948, a mind that had built its entire professional identity on the proposition that the purpose of military force was to destroy the enemy's will and capacity to fight, that the way to do this was to hit the right targets with sufficient force to eliminate them completely, that anything less than this was waste and self-indulgence, and that the costs of the operation, measured in lives and aircraft and ordnance, were irrelevant except as inputs into the operational calculation. What LeMay found when he arrived at SAC was an organization that did not, by his standards, exist. The bombers were in poor condition, the crews were undertrained, the maintenance was inadequate. The war plans were, in his assessment, fantasies, documents that described operations that the actual force could not execute. He ordered an unannounced readiness test shortly after taking command, sending the entire SAC force on a simulated bombing mission against Dayton, Ohio. Not one aircraft completed the mission successfully. Navigation was off, bombing was off, equipment failed, procedures were not followed. LeMay was not angry in the way that a man who had expected better would be angry. He was analytical. He had a problem. He would fix the problem. He spent the next several years rebuilding SAC from the foundations, instituting training regimes of an intensity that bordered on punitive, establishing performance standards that washed out crews who could not meet them, creating a culture of readiness that made SAC, by the mid-1950s, the most capable and most powerful military force in the history of the world. At its peak under LeMay, SAC had roughly 2,000 bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons and a crew force trained to fly them at any hour of the day or night from bases around the world. It maintained airborne alert, bombers in the air at all times, loaded with nuclear weapons, waiting for the order, and ground alert, with crews sitting in aircraft, ready to be airborne within 15 minutes of a warning. LeMay built this force with the explicit purpose of being able to execute a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union that would destroy the Soviet Union's capacity to wage war in a single, coordinated strike. The force was real. The capability was real. What LeMay wanted, and what he spent years arguing for in formal and informal settings from the Pentagon briefing room to the Oval Office, was the order to use it. The specific proposals LeMay made for a preemptive nuclear attack on the Soviet Union are documented, imperfectly, in records that were declassified gradually from the 1970s onward, and the picture they present is of a man who was not speaking loosely or theoretically, but who had specific operational plans and specific windows in mind, and who presented them to his superiors with the expectation that they would be acted upon. The core of LeMay's argument was simple and, on its own terms, coherent. The United States had a nuclear advantage over the Soviet Union that was decisive in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when the Soviets had few atomic weapons and limited means of delivering them. But that advantage was temporary and shrinking. Every year that passed, the Soviets built more weapons and developed better delivery systems. And every year, the cost of a preemptive strike rose, and the probability that such a strike could be truly decisive declined. The logic of the situation, as LeMay presented it, was that the United States should strike before the window closed. Strike now, while the advantage was overwhelming. Strike the Soviet nuclear capability, the Soviet Air Force, the Soviet industrial base, the Soviet military command structure. Strike it all at once with everything SAC had, in a coordinated attack that would eliminate the Soviet Union's ability to retaliate and leave it prostrate and unable to prosecute a war. LeMay believed, and said he believed, that such an attack was both militarily feasible and morally justified, because the alternative, waiting until the Soviets achieved nuclear parity or superiority and then fighting a nuclear war on less favorable terms, would cost more lives, not fewer. The preemptive strike was, in LeMay's moral calculus, the humanitarian option. He made versions of this argument to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He made it to Secretaries of Defense. He made it in formal briefings to President Eisenhower, who listened to it and declined to be persuaded by it, which in Eisenhower's careful and controlled way meant that the idea was noted and filed and not acted upon, and LeMay went back to Omaha and continued building the force and continued making the argument. The specific date that appears most frequently in the documentary record of these presentations is 1954, the year in which several things aligned to create what LeMay regarded as the optimal window. The United States had a substantial stockpile of thermonuclear weapons following the ED. Successful test of the hydrogen bomb in 1952, the Soviets had not yet deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, and SAC's bomber force was at a level of readiness and capability that LeMay judged sufficient to execute the strike plan with a high probability of success. In 1954, LeMay presented to the Joint Chiefs a briefing that described a preemptive strike option in terms specific enough to constitute a formal proposal. The briefing outlined target sets, delivery routes, weapon assignments, and estimated results. The results, measured in Soviet military and industrial capacity destroyed, were presented as decisive. The results, measured in Soviet civilian casualties, were not the focus of the briefing, because LeMay's framework did not treat civilian casualties as a variable to be minimized, but as an inherent consequence of hitting the targets that needed to be hit, and the targets that needed to be hit happened to be located near where Soviet civilians lived. The briefing did not result in authorization to proceed. It was received by men who understood what LeMay was proposing and who were not prepared to authorize it, partly because the moral weight of initiating a nuclear war was one they could not bring themselves to accept, and partly because the political consequences of doing so, in a world where American global leadership depended on being perceived as the defensive rather than the aggressive party, were incalculable. LeMay accepted the refusal and continued arguing. The unauthorized overflights of Soviet territory that LeMay ordered were a different category of action because they did not require authorization, or rather, because LeMay acted on the assumption that his authority as SAC commander extended to intelligence-gathering operations that served his operational planning requirements, whether or not the National Security Council or the President had specifically approved them. The August 1954 overflight of Chukotka was not an isolated incident. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through the mid-1950s, LeMay ordered or approved a series of intelligence overflights along and across the Soviet periphery, using modified reconnaissance aircraft that flew routes designed to probe Soviet radar coverage, identify air defense installations, photograph military facilities, and gather the electronic intelligence that SAC needed to build its targeting plans. Some of these missions flew along the borders. Others crossed into Soviet airspace and flew deep over Soviet territory before returning. The Soviets detected many of them and responded with protests that the United States denied. Some of the aircraft were shot at. A number were shot down, their crews killed or captured, their fates officially classified, and in several cases not fully acknowledged until decades later. LeMay knew the risks. He ordered the missions anyway. The argument he made internally was that the intelligence was necessary for the war plans, and the war plans were necessary for deterrence, and deterrence was necessary for national survival, and that the risk of losing a crew or an aircraft was a manageable operational cost given the value of the intelligence. He did not make this argument to the president before ordering the missions, because making it to the president before ordering the missions would have required the president to authorize them, and the president might have declined to do so. It was easier to act and explain afterward, if explanation was required. It usually was not, because the missions produced results that were useful to the people who reviewed them, and useful results tend to generate institutional tolerance for the methods that produce them. The Eisenhower administration eventually formalized the overflight program through the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, which gave the CIA, rather than SAC, primary control over overflights, and which was supposed to operate under presidential authorization for each mission. LeMay regarded this institutionalization as a bureaucratic imposition on what had been a straightforward operational requirement, and his relationship with the CIA's overflight program was one of competitive resentment. He was being regulated. He had previously been unregulated. The difference mattered to him in ways that went beyond the specific intelligence question, and into the deeper issue of who controlled the instruments of American strategic power, and on what terms. The question of civilian control of nuclear weapons was not, during the LeMay years at SAC, as settled as the constitutional framework suggested it should have been. The formal chain of command ran from the President, through the Secretary of Defense, through the Joint Chiefs, to the unified commanders, of whom LeMay was one. The President had the authority to authorize the use of nuclear weapons, and that authority was supposed to be exercised through a system of positive controls, physical and procedural, safeguards that prevented nuclear weapons from being launched without explicit presidential authorization. In practice, during the late 1940s and early 1950s, the positive control system was considerably less robust than the formal framework implied. The early nuclear weapons required significant assembly time and were stored in configurations that gave military commanders substantial discretion over their use in circumstances where communication with Washington might be interrupted. LeMay, who thought about these things operationally, was aware of the gap between the formal chain of command and the practical realities of nuclear custody, and he was not, by the accounts of the people who knew him, particularly distressed by it. He believed that the decision to use nuclear weapons in the right circumstances was a military decision that required military judgment, and he believed that he possessed that judgment more reliably than the civilians who were nominally in authority over him. He expressed this belief in various ways at various times. He told subordinates that if he received information indicating a Soviet attack was imminent, he would not wait for authorization before launching SAC's bombers. He designed SAC's alert procedures in ways that minimized the time between the decision to launch and the actual launch, on the theory that every minute of decision-making time was a minute in which the enemy could be destroying the aircraft that needed to get airborne. The procedures that minimize launch time also minimize the opportunity for the civilian chain of command to intervene between the military's assessment of the situation and the execution of the launch order. This was not an accident. LeMay understood what he was building. He built it deliberately. He believed it was the right thing to build. The civilians who reviewed SAC's procedures during this period and found them alarming were told, in various ways, that the procedures were operationally necessary and that the alternative, longer decision loops, more points of civilian review, would cost lives in the event of an actual Soviet attack. The argument was not without merit, and the civilians who received it were generally not in a position to evaluate it on its technical merits, and so the procedures remained more or less as LeMay had designed them until civilian authority over nuclear weapons became a political priority in the late 1950s, and the Kennedy administration instituted the reforms that finally brought the custody and control of nuclear weapons into closer alignment with the constitutional chain of command. Dwight Eisenhower's relationship with Curtis LeMay was one of the more consequential tensions in the history of Cold War military-civilian relations, and it is worth examining in some detail because it illustrates both the limits of civilian authority over the military during this period and the specific ways in which Eisenhower managed to maintain those limits against a subordinate who was genuinely trying to push through them. Eisenhower was himself a general and understood the military mind in ways that few civilian presidents could, and he understood LeMay specifically as a man of extraordinary operational competence and genuine strategic dangerousness. He valued the first and managed the second with the patience and indirection of a man who had spent 30 years in an institution that resolved its internal conflicts through process rather than confrontation. When LeMay presented his preemptive strike proposals, Eisenhower did not say no in a way that closed the door. He asked questions. He requested additional analysis. He commissioned studies. He sent the proposals to the National Security Council for review. He created procedural labyrinths that the proposals had to navigate and that they consistently failed to navigate, not because Eisenhower had ruled them out, but because the process of institutional review kept producing objections that required additional response, and the additional response led to further review, and the further review consumed time during which the strategic window that LeMay was arguing was closing continued to close without the strike being authorized. This was Eisenhower's method. Not to confront LeMay's arguments directly and be drawn into a debate on LeMay's terms, but to manage them through institutional process in ways that prevented them from ever arriving at the point of decision. LeMay found this maddening. He said so. In the direct way he said everything. He told colleagues that the administration lacked the will to do what the strategic situation required. He told subordinates that the civilians did not understand the problem. He went as close to insubordination as a man of his institutional sophistication could go without actually crossing the line, making his views known in settings where they would reach the people he wanted to reach while maintaining the formal posture of a subordinate awaiting orders. Eisenhower, for his part, kept LeMay in command of SAC until 1957 because LeMay's operational competence was genuine, and his ability to manage and maintain the force that gave American nuclear deterrence its credibility was irreplaceable, and because removing him would have required finding a reason that would survive internal military scrutiny and congressional review, and the real reason that LeMay's strategic views were too aggressive to be safely indulged, was not a reason that could be stated publicly without raising questions about the basis of American nuclear strategy that Eisenhower did not want raised. So LeMay stayed, and Eisenhower managed him, and the preemptive strike was never authorized, and the world continued not to end, which is perhaps the most significant policy outcome of the Eisenhower years, and one that has received less credit than it deserves. When John F. Kennedy was inaugurated in January 1961, he inherited a military establishment that had been shaped decisively by LeMay's decade at SAC and by the strategic culture LeMay had built. Kennedy had read enough strategic literature and had enough of a feel for the institutional dynamics of the Pentagon to know that the military he was inheriting was not entirely under civilian control in the way the Constitution described, and he came into office with a disposition to assert that control more firmly than his predecessor had. LeMay, who had been made Air Force Chief of Staff in 1961 after leaving SAC, sat across from Kennedy in National Security Council meetings and Joint Chiefs briefings, and represented a set of strategic views that Kennedy found both alarming and, in the specific institutional context of the early 1960s, impossible to simply dismiss. The Bay of Pigs disaster in April 1961, 3 months into Kennedy's presidency, had damaged Kennedy's credibility with the military in ways that LeMay and other senior officers were not subtle about exploiting. Kennedy was young. Kennedy had not served in a command capacity in World War II. Kennedy had authorized a covert operation that had failed catastrophically and had refused at the last minute to provide the air cover that the military had told him was essential. These facts formed LeMay's assessment of his civilian superior, and the assessment was not favorable, and LeMay was not good at pretending his assessments were different from what they were. The relationship between the two men was one of sustained mutual wariness, Kennedy aware that LeMay commanded significant institutional authority and public respect, and could not be treated as simply another insubordinate officer. LeMay aware that Kennedy was the commander-in-chief, and that the forms of civilian authority had to be observed even if their substance was, in LeMay's view, being misapplied. The collision between these two men and the worldviews they represented found its most intense expression during 13 days in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the event through which LeMay's strategic philosophy was most completely tested against reality, and the test produced results that LeMay found unconvincing, even as they persuaded almost everyone else who was present. When American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft confirmed on October 15, 1962, that the Soviet Union was installing medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, LeMay's assessment of what should be done was immediate, certain, and entirely consistent with everything he had argued for his entire career. Bomb them. Launch airstrikes against the missile sites, the airfields, the surface-to-air missile batteries, and any Soviet military personnel who happened to be in the vicinity. Do it within 48 hours before the missiles became operational. Follow the airstrikes with an invasion. Resolve the situation by force, decisively, while the force necessary to do so decisively was available and, while waiting, would only make it harder. This was not a view LeMay held in isolation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, shared the military assessment that airstrikes offered the cleanest resolution of the crisis, and LeMay was the most vocal and the most aggressive advocate of that position in the ExComm, the executive committee of the National Security Council that Kennedy assembled to advise him during the crisis. LeMay sat in those meetings and made his arguments with the directness that was his only mode, and Kennedy sat across from him and listened and did not do what LeMay was telling him to do. Kennedy chose the naval blockade, which the administration called a quarantine, to avoid the technical legal implications of the word blockade, as the initial American response, buying time for diplomacy while signaling resolve. LeMay told Kennedy, in a meeting on October 19th, that the blockade was the worst possible course of action, that it was, almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich, that it would demonstrate weakness and invite Soviet aggression. He said this to the President of the United States. He said it in the presence of the other Joint Chiefs and several civilian advisors. He was not wrong that the analogy to Munich was the kind of thing that carried emotional weight in that room, with men who had all lived through World War II, and many of whom had fought in it. But he was using it to push a president toward a decision that, had Kennedy made it, would have had consequences that LeMay's operational framework was not equipped to account for. What Kennedy knew, and what LeMay's framework systematically excluded, was the question of what happened after the airstrikes. The Soviet missiles in Cuba were not the only Soviet nuclear weapons that existed. The Soviet Union had submarine-launched missiles, land-based ICBMs, and bomber aircraft capable of reaching American cities. Destroying the missiles in Cuba with air strikes would eliminate one threat while triggering a Soviet response to the destruction of their military equipment and the killing of their personnel, and the nature of that response was not something that could be reliably predicted or controlled. Kennedy also knew, though LeMay did not, that there were Soviet tactical nuclear weapons already in Cuba, with authority pre-delegated to local commanders to use them if the United States invaded. This information would not become fully public for decades, but its implications are clear in retrospect. Had Kennedy followed LeMay's advice and launched the airstrikes and the invasion, the probability of nuclear weapons being used in the resulting combat was not negligible. It may have been quite high. The world that existed on November 1st, 1962, a world in which the crisis had been resolved through diplomacy and the missiles had been withdrawn in exchange for American assurances and the secret withdrawal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey, was a world that LeMay regarded as a humiliation and a defeat. Kennedy regarded it as the most important achievement of his presidency. History has, on the whole, sided with Kennedy. LeMay's behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis did not end with the XCOM debates. As the crisis moved toward its diplomatic resolution in the last days of October 1962, LeMay continued pushing for military action. When Kennedy reached his agreement with Khrushchev on October 27th and 28th, LeMay's response, delivered in a meeting of the Joint Chiefs, was that they had been had. He wanted to launch the airstrikes anyway, after the agreement had been reached, on the grounds that the agreement was not sufficient and that the military opportunity should not be allowed to pass. He was persuaded not to do this by the other members of the Joint Chiefs, who recognized that launching an attack after the president had publicly announced the resolution of the crisis would have been an act of military insubordination that the civilian government could not have tolerated and would not have survived. LeMay pulled back. But the fact that the argument was made at all, that the most senior uniformed officer in the United States Air Force was, in the final days of the most dangerous nuclear crisis in history, advocating military strikes that the president had explicitly decided not to authorize, is a fact that the history of civilian control of the military does not treat with sufficient seriousness. It was not a close call in the sense that LeMay was likely to have his way. He was not. But it was a close call in the sense that LeMay was genuinely arguing for a course of action that would have required the military to act against the expressed decision of its civilian commander, and that the argument was being made by a man of sufficient institutional standing that it had to be taken seriously rather than simply dismissed. The institutional culture that had produced LeMay, that had rewarded his aggressiveness and his results orientation and his contempt for civilian second-guessing across 3 decades of distinguished service, had also produced this moment. A general who believed he knew better than the president, who had spent his career building a case for that belief, and who came, in the most dangerous week of the Cold War, very close to a position where the difference between his preference and presidential policy was a decision he might have felt entitled to resolve on his own terms. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, LeMay's influence declined, though his tenure as Air Force Chief of Staff continued until 1965. Kennedy's management of the crisis had demonstrated, in a setting visible to every senior official in the government, that LeMay's preferred approach, the application of overwhelming force at the first opportunity, was not the only or the best framework for navigating the specific kind of confrontation that nuclear weapons had made the defining feature of great power competition. The credibility of the alternative framework, measured response, escalation control, negotiated resolution, depended precisely on the willingness to not do what LeMay would have done, and the crisis had demonstrated that this willingness could be sustained even under the most intense pressure. LeMay drew the lesson that Kennedy had gotten lucky. Kennedy drew the lesson that LeMay's framework was catastrophically unsuited to the nuclear age. They were both drawing on the same 13 days of evidence and arriving at opposite conclusions, which tells you something important about the degree to which strategic assessment during the Cold War was shaped by prior beliefs that the evidence could not dislodge because the evidence was always ambiguous and the beliefs were always prior. LeMay retired from the Air Force in February 1965, having spent 35 years in uniform and having arrived at a moment in American military history when the approach he represented was being systematically displaced by the systems analysis and cost-benefit frameworks of Robert McNamara's Pentagon, an approach LeMay despised with a completeness that he expressed in terms that were, even by his standards, unusually unguarded. He thought McNamara's analysts were children playing with things they did not understand. He may not have been entirely wrong about that either, though his alternative was not obviously better. In 1968, LeMay agreed to run as the vice presidential candidate on George Wallace's American Independent Party ticket, a decision that completed, in political terms, the trajectory that his military career had suggested. A man who had spent his professional life arguing that the existing institutional framework was inadequate to the threat, and who had decided in retirement that the political system required the same kind of remedy he had always applied to military problems, which was to replace the people who were failing with someone willing to do what was necessary. The Wallace-LeMay ticket received nearly 10 million votes and carried 5 southern states, the best third-party performance in a presidential election since 1924. LeMay's contribution to the campaign was primarily negative. His willingness to discuss the potential use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam, expressed in terms that were more explicit than his running mate found comfortable, generated press coverage that the campaign spent weeks managing. LeMay said what he thought. He had always said what he thought. The fact that what he thought alarmed people had never previously modified what he said, and it did not do so in 1968. He lost the election and returned to private life and wrote his memoirs and gave speeches and watched from the remove of California as the country he had served continued to navigate the Cold War with the caution and restraint that he had spent his career arguing was the wrong approach. He died in October 1990. 3 months before the Soviet Union, he had wanted to destroy preemptively in 1954, collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions without a single nuclear weapon being fired. He did not, as far as the public record shows, revise his views in light of this outcome. He had built the force. He had made the arguments. The fact that the arguments had not been accepted and the force had not been used in the way he had intended, it was not, in his framework, evidence that he had been wrong. It was evidence that the country had been lucky. Whether the country had been lucky or had been wise, or had been both, or whether the distinction between the two is as clear as LeMay believed it was. These are questions that the history of Curtis LeMay's career poses without answering, and that the history of nuclear weapons in the Cold War poses every time it is examined with the seriousness it requires. The problem that LeMay's career exposes, the problem of civilian control of nuclear weapons in a democracy, was not solved by his departure from the scene. It was managed imperfectly through a series of reforms that the Kennedy and Johnson administrations instituted in the early 1960s, and that subsequent administrations extended and refined. The Permissive Action Link System, which required specific authorization codes before nuclear weapons could be armed and launched, was developed in the early 1960s, partly in response to civilian concern that the military's custody of nuclear weapons was insufficiently controlled. The system of positive control, which required explicit presidential authorization for nuclear launches rather than permitting military commanders to act on their own assessment of the threat, was tightened after the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the degree to which pre-delegated launch authority had created risks that the formal chain of command did not account for. The single integrated operational plan, the war plan that governed how SAC would execute a nuclear attack, was reviewed and revised by civilian authorities in ways that gave the president more options short of the massive preemptive strike that LeMay had always preferred and that the original SIOP had built around. These were real reforms that made real differences in the probability that a nuclear war would begin through military initiative rather than civilian decision. They did not solve the underlying problem, because the underlying problem is structural. A democracy that fields nuclear weapons must entrust those weapons to military professionals who will inevitably develop views about when and how they should be used. And those views will not always align with the views of elected civilians who have different information, different responsibilities, and different time horizons. The alignment between military and civilian judgment over nuclear use is not guaranteed by the constitutional chain of command, because the chain of command is a formal structure that can be observed in letter and violated in spirit, as LeMay demonstrated across 3 decades, and as the history of every nuclear-armed state demonstrates in its own way. Managing the gap between the formal and the actual, between who is supposed to control the weapons and who really does, is the permanent work of democratic governance in the nuclear age, and it is work that is never complete and never without risk, because the people doing the managing are human, and the weapons they are managing are not, and the margin for error between getting it right and ending the world is uncomfortably small. What LeMay thought he was doing, across the decades of his career, and the arguments he made, and the missions he ordered, and the proposals he presented, and the crises he tried to resolve through the application of force, was protecting the United States. He was not wrong to think the Soviet Union was a genuine threat. It was. He was not wrong to think that American military superiority in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a wasting asset that the passage of time would erode. It was. He was not wrong to think that the men above him in the chain of command were sometimes insufficiently informed about the operational realities he was managing. They were. What he was wrong about was the nature of the problem that nuclear weapons had created, the way in which the logic of preemption, applied to weapons of this kind, led not to the security he was trying to achieve, but to its opposite, A world in which the decision to strike first would produce retaliation rather than victory, in which overwhelming force was not the answer to every strategic question, and in which the restraint he despised was not weakness, but the only form of wisdom available to men who had built weapons capable of ending civilization, and then found themselves responsible for deciding when to use them. LeMay never accepted this because accepting it would have required him to accept that the framework he had built his entire professional identity on, the framework that had worked in Europe and the Pacific, that had broken Japanese industrial society and forced the surrender of a nation, that had made him the most effective commander of strategic bombing in the history of air warfare, did not transfer to the nuclear age in the way he believed it did. He had built the most powerful military force in the history of the world, and he wanted to use it, and the people who prevented him from using it were, in his view, failing their responsibility to the nation they served. He was wrong. The world that survived his career is the evidence of his wrongness. But the problem he embodied, the problem of a democracy that fields weapons of this kind and must therefore trust military professionals with the custody of those weapons and then find ways to maintain meaningful civilian authority over their use, is not a problem that his career solved or that his death resolved. It is the permanent background condition of the nuclear age, and it will remain so as long as the weapons remain, which may be the rest of human history, or may be somewhat less than that, depending on the choices made by the specific people who, at any given moment, are sitting in the rooms where those choices are made.